The morning air at Flaxborough railway station carried that peculiar blend of promise and tedium that townsfolk had long come to accept as ordinary. Sunlight struggled through a pall of damp mist, glinting faintly off the polished ironwork of the clock tower. To the casual observer it seemed merely quaint, though Inspector Pirbright, walking with his habitual deliberation, noted at once that the station clock was slightly fast. A single minute, hardly noticeable, yet to him, precise as always, it signalled that the day was already veering from expectation. He passed through the concourse with his characteristic calm, acknowledging the familiar faces. Mrs. Tremaine, perched in her habitual station seat corner, observed the incoming trains with a vigilant eye, notebook balanced delicately on her lap. Miss Fenton, ever the embodiment of propriety, monitored the platform with a faint, restrained frown. Mr. Howlett, spectacles slipping perilously down his nose, whispered muttered objections about timetables and punctuality, while Mr. Jebb fussed about with the station buffet, checking, rechecking, and patting down the surface of his tart displays as though the custard might revolt. It was Miss Fenton who first drew attention to the slight irregularity that would quietly disturb the ordinary order of the morning. "There's something odd about the parcels," she remarked, glancing toward the left luggage office. "Mr. Simmons left one unattended yesterday. I noticed it myself." Pirbright inclined his head, carefully neutral, concealing the spark of curiosity that had already alighted. Parcels left temporarily unguarded were a regular feature of station life. Simmons, the porter, had a peculiar talent for misplacing items, as if the station required its minor chaos. Yet the tone Miss Fenton carried was subtle but insistent, implying a deviation from mere carelessness. Mrs. Tremaine interjected with delicate alarm. "Do you suppose it could be—" Her voice trailed, filled with anticipation of minor scandal. Pirbright responded softly, measured in his choice of words. "We shall see. One unattended parcel does not a crime constitute." His gaze, however, drifted over the polished concourse, the faintly tilting station clock, and the orderly, if slightly anxious, townfolk. There was a pattern forming in the air, though invisible to those engrossed in their own preoccupations. A disturbance in the buffet drew his attention next. Mr. Jebb, station-master's cousin and self-appointed custodian of social proprieties, had discovered that several custard tarts had been crushed during delivery. His outrage was both intense and entirely social, as though the dignity of the station itself had been affronted. Pirbright approached with polite curiosity. "Mr. Jebb, I trust the tarts are not engaged in some secret rebellion?" he asked, a dry inflection masking the attentiveness of his observation. Jebb's response was solemn and meticulous. "Inspector, it is the principle, sir. Order must be maintained." A smear of flour at the cuff betrayed minor frustration or oversight, a detail Pirbright filed away quietly. Returning to the main concourse, his attention was drawn again to the clock. Now it had gained 2 minutes. Such a slight discrepancy would escape most notice, but Pirbright, ever attuned to minor irregularities, considered it more carefully than the station's frequent murmurings. Then came a more immediately tangible disruption. A pigeon, apparently accustomed to human civility, alighted upon Mrs. Tremaine's bench and proceeded with considerable industry to scatter the contents of her handbag. The notebook, gloves, and small personal effects tumbled across the floor. A collective intake of breath accompanied the minor calamity, followed by a cascade of whispers and gentle tutting. Mrs. Tremaine, flustered but maintaining an air of dignity, recovered her possessions. Mr. Howlett muttered about vermin and public hygiene, while Miss Fenton's frown deepened as though the natural order had been breached. Pirbright's eyes, calm and observant, catalogued each reaction. It was in these small human responses that he found more significance than in the pigeon itself. Among the scattered items, a crumpled ticket stub emerged, damp and partially hidden under the bench. It was the return leg of a journey to Bramblewick dated the previous day. The discovery was minor in itself, yet the juxtaposition with the parcel and the clock's discrepancy suggested a confluence of peculiarities worth noting. By the time he reached his office at the precinct, he allowed himself a quiet reflection. The clock's minute gain, the scattered handbag, the misdelivered parcel, and the custard tart indignation were seemingly unrelated threads. Yet in the pattern of minor human disturbances, there existed a subtle harmony of disorder, a small, almost imperceptible web that Flaxborough's social machinery had begun to reveal. He poured himself tea with care, mindful of crumbs and spilt leaves. A note was drafted for Simmons requesting the list of parcels delivered yesterday and any observations made regarding their handling. No urgency was implied. In Flaxborough, the world unfolded at its own peculiar pace, and Pirbright understood the advantage of letting the town's rhythms reveal their secrets. He reflected on the delicate, invisible structures that governed Flaxborough, the hierarchy of respectability, the careful navigation of minor grievances, and the subtle art of gossip. Each person, in their ordinary routines, contributed to the town's orderly chaos, their minor deceptions and small anxieties accumulating beneath a surface of civility. Finally, with his notes complete, he recorded in the precise hand he reserved for official observation. Observe parcel irregularities. Monitor Mrs. Tremane's journey to Bramblewick. Inquire delicately into Simmons' habits. Clock anomaly. Noted. Outside, the station clock continued its quiet advancement. A minute gained, a minute unaccounted for. Flaxborough, serene and ordinary, carried on with its routines, unaware of the minute irregularities that would soon assemble into something more intricate. Beneath the station clock, secrets already whispered, waiting for the patient eye to discern them. By mid-morning, news of the minor disturbances at the station had already begun its quiet perambulation through Flaxborough, carried with brisk efficiency by market-goers, errand-runners, and shopkeepers who knew the town's appetite for speculation better than any headline. Mrs. Tremaine, clutching her restored handbag, found herself subjected to a subtle inquisition from the grocer, the butcher, and a scattering of acquaintances who approached under the pretense of casual concern. Each visitor offered a slightly different version of events. The pigeon was described variously as aggressive, daring, or downright menacing. The misplaced parcel became larger or smaller depending on the teller, and the station clock, as if animated by collective imagination, was declared either worse than usual or oddly defiant of proper time. Miss Fenton, meanwhile, attended to her morning rounds with a quiet air of moral indignation, remarking upon the apparent disorder as she passed the town hall and the bakery. She recounted the pigeon incident in tones measured but pointed, emphasizing its impropriety and the lack of attention it suggested among station staff. Mr. Howlett had taken to muttering his own timeline grievances in the library, consulted by a few sympathetic listeners who nodded solemnly as though the speed of trains and the behavior of birds were matters deserving civic oversight. At the market, speculation branched in unexpected directions. Some theorized that the parcel had been tampered with. Others suggested it contained something more exciting than a mere railway errand. Whispers about Simmons' carelessness intertwined with vague notions of theft, though no evidence suggested as much, and the station master's reputation as a diligent, if mild-mannered administrator offered counterweight to the more scandalous possibilities. Even the custard tart disaster was retold, enlarged by selective memory into a tale of catastrophic dessert mishap, as though the confectionery itself had declared war upon civility. Pirbright, moving among the quietly agitated townfolk with careful observation, allowed these rumours to develop. He noted how each individual altered the narrative to reflect personal biases. Mrs. Tremain's minor indignities magnified into public affronts. The station porter's habitual sloppiness was regarded as indicative of moral failing. Miss Fenton's propriety became an instrument of social policing. The detective's eye, steady and unswayed, recorded the nuances, the contradictions, and the small inconsistencies that would later prove significant. By late morning, the town's tea rooms had become informal salons of speculation. Mr. Fawkes, the local journalist, spread accounts of the incidents with his usual flair, embellishing certain details to suit the taste of readers hungry for intrigue. Patrons debated the station clock's minute gain as though it were a portent, and conjectured on motives behind the scattered parcels and the pigeons' audacious behaviour. Even children, guided by overheard commentary, whispered imaginative stories of daring theft and secret errands, unaware that their embellishments would find reflection in adult gossip. In quieter corners, older townsfolk indulged in gentle humour at the expense of the younger generation's sensibilities. They exchanged knowing glances regarding Mrs. Tremain's distress and Miss Fenton's moral rectitude, quietly enjoying the minor turbulence while asserting that Flaxborough's order would inevitably prevail. Pirbright observed all of this with polite detachment, noting the ways in which human nature sought narrative coherence, often at the expense of truth. The council, receiving word of the morning's incidents via early telegrams and telephone calls, convened briefly in whispered deliberation. Opinions varied. Some suggested immediate oversight of the station's parcels and clock. Others dismissed the matter as negligible, a trifling disturbance amplified by small-town anxieties. The members themselves, each conscious of reputation and precedence, framed their comments with cautious civility, careful not to assign blame where impropriety might reflect back upon themselves. Meanwhile, Mrs. Tremain, encouraged by the unsolicited attention, amplified her own account with a mixture of indignation and pride, suggesting that the pigeon's attack had been deliberate, a targeted affront to her person, and, by extension, to her social standing. Miss Fenton, hearing variations of her version, refined her observations to maintain moral authority, and Mr. Howlett's mutterings gained a tone of civic gravitas, lending the town's chatter a veneer of legitimacy. Through all this, Pirbright moved as a quiet observer among the currents of social energy. He noted how each embellishment, each slight exaggeration, provided a framework for understanding human motive. Pride, envy, anxiety, and the desire to be regarded as correct or authoritative. The detective made no interruptions, allowing the stories to ripple outward, as one might observe a pond disturbed by a stone. He understood that truth would eventually emerge, not through insistence, but through the natural inconsistencies inherent in human recounting. By mid-afternoon, the station itself had become a locus for private commentary. Travellers arrived with anticipatory interest, noting minor anomalies with exaggerated scrutiny, while employees adjusted their routines to accommodate the suddenly heightened attention. Simmons, unaware of the evolving narrative, continued his work, slightly flustered but largely unperturbed, while Mr. Jebb's fussing intensified, as though he alone bore responsibility for the collective anxiety. Pirbright, in measured steps, noted the precise reactions of each individual, the twitch of a lip, the frown that lingered a moment too long, the subtle avoidance of eye contact. It was in these observations, small and easily overlooked, that the fabric of the unfolding situation revealed itself. The town had transformed a minor irregularity, a clock a minute fast, a parcel temporarily misplaced, a pigeon's disruption, into a social event with layers of interpretation and expectation. Pirbright, aware of the subtle orchestration of human behavior, filed these insights quietly, understanding that the gossip, the embellishments, and the polite indignations would ultimately guide him toward the underlying truth long before the town itself suspected its own misunderstandings. By the time the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the concourse and highlighting the minute misalignment of the station clock, the pattern was clear to Pirbright. The town's reactions, though amplified and distorted, had revealed not only the likely sequence of events but also the intricate network of minor rivalries, secret resentments, and social ambitions that formed Flaxborough's everyday life. Every whispered opinion, every embellished tale, and every polite indignation served as a piece of the puzzle, waiting for the inspector's calm discernment to assemble them into coherent understanding. Pirbright began his inquiries the following morning with the methodical patience that had earned him both respect and occasional mild exasperation from colleagues. He started at the station itself, speaking first to Simmons, the porter, who appeared entirely unaware that the town had already assembled a narrative of suspicion around him. Simmons's hair, perpetually in need of trimming, had an anxious dishevelment that seemed only partially related to his duties, while his fingers fumbled over the register of parcels as though the simple act of accounting required delicate negotiation. "Good morning, Simmons," Pirbright said, his tone even, polite, inviting disclosure without pressure. "I believe we had a minor anomaly yesterday. Could you walk me through the parcels you handled?" Simmons, eager to prove diligence, began recounting each delivery with careful specificity, though contradictions emerged almost immediately. He recalled delivering a parcel to the buffet office, yet Mrs. Tremain's account suggested he had not, and he mentioned no journey to Bramblewick, despite the crumpled ticket in her handbag. Pirbright listened without comment, noting both the inconsistencies and the small hesitations in speech. Next, he approached Mr. Jebb, whose indignation over the custard tart incident had yet to abate. Jebb's narrative was theatrical, but punctuated with factual minutiae. The exact timing of deliveries, the sequence of tarts being unpacked, and the indignities suffered by his arrangements. Pirbright allowed him to speak at length, occasionally nodding with exaggerated attention to encourage further disclosure. Beneath Jebb's fussing, Pirbright discerned minor rivalries, resentment toward Simmons, anxiety about public perception, and an instinctive desire to maintain his personal authority over the station's small domain. The inspector then turned to Miss Fenton, who was arranging flowers in the station waiting room, apparently to restore a sense of order. Her account emphasized propriety and social consequences. She remarked on the pigeon with moral gravity, on Mrs. Tremain's distress with faintly pointed observation, and on the station clock's minute discrepancy, as if it were emblematic of wider disorder. Pirbright observed the precision with which she framed her statements, the careful selection of detail, and the subtle moral undertones. Her narrative was factual, but it also revealed personal vigilance over social decorum. The interrogation of each individual revealed overlaps and inconsistencies. Simmons's oblivion contrasted with Jebb's meticulous fussing. Miss Fenton's moral framing contrasted with Mrs. Tremain's dramatized personal affront. Each person, in their retelling, inadvertently offered clues about habits, priorities, and latent tensions. Pirbright made careful notes, capturing not only events, but also demeanor. How long a glance lingered, the slight tremor in a hand, the way hesitation preceded speech. In the course of these interviews, a subtle pattern began to emerge. The parcels and the crumpled ticket suggested movements that Simmons could not fully account for. The clock's minute gain coincided with brief moments when attention was diverted elsewhere. The pigeon incident had elicited reactions that exposed interpersonal sensitivities more than any factual disturbance. Pirbright, registering these details quietly, saw in them the faint outlines of the social architecture behind the surface order. The station master, arriving mid-morning, contributed a measured account of yesterday's events. He confirmed Simmons's general diligence but noted moments of distraction, particularly when the station was unusually busy. He also mentioned a brief exchange with an unfamiliar gentleman who had inquired about parcels for a late train, a detail that Simmons had omitted. Pirbright, listening closely, asked only gentle, clarifying questions, allowing the station master to continue in his own measured rhythm. By noon, Pirbright had completed his initial round of inquiries. He reviewed his notes quietly in the precinct office, arranging facts against behavior, anecdote against gesture. Every inconsistency, every hesitation, every minor exaggeration had been catalogued. He noted that the simplest seeming anomalies, the misplaced parcel, the clock's errant minute, Mrs. Tremaine's scattered handbag, the custard tart debacle, were linked not by obvious criminal intent, but by social behavior, attentions, jealousies, habits, and the subtle assertion of authority. Pirbright reflected on the differing perspectives he had gathered. Simmons was careless but honest. Jebb was meticulous yet easily offended. Miss Fenton was conscientious yet subtly moralizing. Mrs. Tremaine was expressive, prone to embellishment, yet grounded in truth. By listening without interruption, Pirbright allowed them to reveal contradictions themselves, constructing an invisible map of the day's minor disturbances and their social resonances. A brief visit to the left luggage office yielded an additional, seemingly trivial detail. A small smudge on one parcel label, almost imperceptible, suggesting it had been handled more than Simmons recalled. Pirbright recorded this, noting how such a minor mark might intersect with human error, timing, and the station's unusual traffic on that particular morning. By late afternoon, his inquiries had extended to casual conversations with passers-by, who mentioned noticing a gentleman in a dark overcoat lingering near the platforms and a commuter who claimed to have seen a parcel exchanged surreptitiously. Each account, incomplete and occasionally exaggerated, added layers of ambiguity. Pirbright took each with equal weight, aware that the truth often resided between the extremes of story and embellishment. Returning finally to his office, Pirbright reviewed the day's observations. The sequence of events, the pigeon, the parcels, the custard tarts, the slightly fast clock, was clear in outline but obscured by human interpretation. Every minor irregularity had been filtered through pride, anxiety, and habit. The inspector sipped his tea slowly, considering the social fabric that wove these incidents together, the small townsfolk's desire for narrative coherence, and the tiny, telling deviations that would ultimately reveal the true nature of the morning's disturbances. By evening, he had established the initial framework for understanding. Simmons as a convenient scapegoat, but not necessarily guilty. Small acts of social assertion and oversight underpinning the anomalies, and hints of external factors, the mysterious gentleman, the crumpled ticket, that required further observation. Pirbright closed his notebook with quiet satisfaction. The day's inquiries had not solved the puzzle, but they had positioned him to see beyond the apparent simplicity, to recognize that Flaxborough's ordinary order concealed subtle irregularities demanding patient discernment. By the following morning, the atmosphere in Flaxborough was tinged with the gentle, persistent hum of speculation. The station's minor anomalies had grown in reputation overnight, with Simmons's name emerging repeatedly as the convenient locus of error. Mrs. Tremaine, Miss Fenton, and Mr. Jebb had all, in their separate ways, emphasized his inattentiveness, amplifying minor incidents into something that resembled negligence, if not malice. To the casual observer, the evidence appeared neatly aligned. Simmons had been present for the misplaced parcel. The crumpled ticket remained unaccounted for, and the clock's discrepancy coincided with brief absences from the office. Pirbright, arriving at the station with his characteristic deliberation, noted the subtle tension among the staff. Simmons moved with habitual efficiency, but seemed slightly more cautious than usual, casting furtive glances toward his colleagues. The porter's normal cheerfulness was tempered, as though he sensed the town's gaze resting upon him in a way that exceeded ordinary observation. Jeb's vigilance was heightened as well, the slight tremor in his hands betraying his desire to assert authority over both custard tarts and reputation. The inspector began by reviewing the station log, scrutinizing arrivals and departures with a patient eye. The crumpled ticket in Mrs. Tremain's handbag, now clearly a point of interest for the town's gossip, suggested an errand to Bramblewick that Simmons had not recorded in his memory. Pirbright asked gentle questions, careful not to suggest suspicion, and noted the porter's reactions. A micro-expression of hesitation, a subtle adjustment of collar, the faint twitch of fingers across the register. Each small gesture contributed to a composite image that, superficially, painted Simmons as the obvious cause of disorder. Conversations with the station master and buffet staff reinforced this preliminary narrative. The porter's habitual carelessness was emphasized, framed as habitual rather than accidental. Jeb provided further anecdotes of mislaid items and minor infractions, presented with the sort of precision only someone deeply concerned with social order could achieve. Miss Fenton, visiting the concourse under pretext of supervising arrangements, recounted her observations in tones that implied moral oversight. Collectively, their stories created a tidy, if superficial, explanation. Simmons had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, his routines insufficiently attentive. Pirbright, listening, allowed the notion to develop fully, acknowledging it only with polite nods. He observed these small inconsistencies in each account, the precise timing of the parcels, the station clock's minute gain, the pigeon incident's inconsistent description, and the unexpected appearance of a gentleman in dark overcoat. None of these contradictions were particularly alarming in isolation, yet, when considered together, they hinted at a more nuanced reality. The town, meanwhile, had seized upon the first suspect with admirable efficiency. By mid-morning, shopkeepers, commuters, and members of the council referred casually to Simmons as if he were a fait accompli. Comments circulated in the bakery, the library, and the grocer's, each embellishing the porter's carelessness in accordance with personal interpretation. Pirbright noted the ease with which the town assigned culpability, the subtle satisfaction derived from narrative coherence, and the manner in which small incidents gained disproportionate social weight. He allowed these interpretations to continue unchallenged, understanding that premature correction would obscure the natural revelation of truth. Simmons, unaware of the growing consensus, continued his duties with meticulous effort, producing only minor errors, a dropped package, a misaligned timetable, each incident reinforcing the town's impression of his inadequacy. Pirbright catalogued the pattern, recognizing the distinction between human fallibility and intentional wrongdoing. The inspector's attention shifted to small, telling gestures, Jeb's persistent frowning while arranging packages, Miss Fenton's rigid posture, Mrs. Tremain's theatrical fluster. Each behavior provided context for the unfolding narrative, revealing the social mechanisms by which suspicion was amplified. Even minor deviations from habit, Simmons's slightly hurried movements, the station clock's minute gain, served to reinforce the neat alignment of perceived culpability. By afternoon, Pirbright had conducted further private enquiries, discreetly observing commuters and minor staff. He recorded subtle reactions to his polite questioning, micro-expressions of unease, sudden shifts in posture, and the careful avoidance of direct eye contact. In the aggregation of these observations lay more reliable insight than the overt testimony of any single individual. Simmons's status as the first obvious suspect remained socially reinforced, yet the inspector's notes reflected a quiet reservation, an awareness that appearances often concealed deeper truths. An additional, seemingly trivial discovery occurred while examining the left luggage office. A faint smear of ink on one parcel label suggested handling beyond what Simmons recalled. Pirbright noted this without alarm, understanding that the detail's significance would emerge in context with subsequent inquiries and observations. It was precisely this kind of minor irregularity that often differentiated simple error from deliberate intent. By the time the day concluded, the situation had settled into a superficially tidy narrative. Simmons, though diligent, was socially branded as the likely cause of the morning's disarray. The town, satisfied by this neat conclusion, circulated the assumption freely, while Pirbright, quietly patient, maintained an inward reservation. He recognized that this tidy conclusion, convenient though it appeared, might not reflect the true dynamics beneath the station clock's subtle irregularities. Returning to his office, Pirbright reviewed his notes, cataloguing behavioral cues alongside statements, inconsistencies alongside facts. The station clock's slight gain, the crumpled ticket, the pigeon incident, the minor fuss over custard, tarts, and Simmons' apparent carelessness were juxtaposed in a pattern that promised eventual clarity, but only if observed without the distortions of social bias. In Flaxborough, he reflected, truth was rarely immediate. It required patience, discretion, and the careful parsing of human behavior. Pirbright allowed himself a brief moment of reflection, sipping tea with the habitual attention to minor details. The first obvious suspect had emerged neatly in public opinion, yet the inspector's professional instinct, honed over years of observing human foibles, suggested that the narrative was incomplete. The town was prepared to settle upon simplicity, but he, as ever, would wait for the full measure of evidence before passing judgment, confident that Flaxborough would, in its quiet way, reveal its secrets in due course. Pirbright returned to the station the following morning with the same unhurried, deliberate attention that had become his hallmark. The day had begun ordinarily enough, commuters arriving, the platform's iron framework gleaming in a hesitant sunlight, and the station clock ticking slightly ahead as if with mild defiance. Yet his attention was drawn, almost imperceptibly, to a small anomaly he had previously overlooked. Tucked beneath Mrs. Tremain's neatly folded notebook was a railway timetable, dog-eared at a single page and bearing a faint crease that suggested it had been handled in haste, or perhaps in secrecy. He noted the incongruity without outward reaction. The timetable was, by itself, trivial, an everyday object, easily dismissed. Yet the crease, its placement, and the faint smudge of ink along its margin implied care or concealment, qualities that rarely went unnoticed by a trained observer. Pirbright allowed himself a small, inward acknowledgement of interest before returning to his measured movements along the concourse. The parcel, now properly accounted for, had been lodged in the left luggage office with no apparent irregularity. Simmons moved among his duties with careful attention, seemingly oblivious to the scrutiny both town and inspector were giving him. The station clock continued its gentle gain of a minute here, a minute there, unnoticed by all but Pirbright, whose eye caught every subtle shift, however inconsequential it appeared to others. Mrs. Tremain arrived more composed than the day before, yet with the faintest trace of lingering irritation at the pigeon incident. She produced her handbag, inspecting the contents with meticulous attention, and Pirbright observed the care with which she aligned the gloves, notebook, and ticket stub. It was in her precise handling, in the way she glanced at the timetable without comment, that Pirbright noted the incongruities, minor deviations from routine that together suggested attention to an event that had escaped casual notice. In the station buffet, Mr. Jebb fussed over the arrangement of pastries and cutlery, his small indignations more pronounced in the quiet of the morning than in the bustle of travellers. Pirbright allowed the station master's cousin to continue unchallenged, noting the exact sequence of adjustments, the hesitations between movements, and the subtle shifts in gaze that indicated sensitivity to oversight. Even minor fussiness, he reflected, could reveal layers of social intention and hidden anxiety. Miss Fenton, hovering near the platform railing, directed a polite word to a commuter and then, almost imperceptibly, touched the edge of a timetable clipped to the notice board. Her fingers lingered, tracing the line of the paper, an act casual to the unobservant, yet distinctly deliberate to someone trained in observing human nuance. Pirbright filed this quietly. The gesture, small though it was, suggested knowledge or concern beyond the immediate apparent disorder. A brief conversation with Simmons revealed nothing overtly unusual, yet his tone and pauses betrayed slight discomfort when questioned about the specific parcels he had handled the day before. His recollection, accurate in general outline, faltered over the precise times and the unusual arrival of a visitor who had inquired about one particular item. Pirbright registered each hesitation, the micro-expression of concern, the subtle repetition of phrases, all clues to a puzzle hidden beneath the ordinary. While walking the concourse, the inspector's attention returned again to the clock, which now stood a minute and a half fast. It was a trivial discrepancy in itself, yet its persistence alongside the creased timetable and the subtle gestures of the station staff suggested a pattern of minor anomalies, each insignificant alone, but collectively pointing to something more coherent. The mind, Pirbright reflected, often underestimated the quiet persistence of small irregularities. Together they formed a language of disorder that revealed itself only to patient observation. Later, at the left luggage office, a small smudge on a parcel label, hardly perceptible to an untrained eye, caught his attention once more. The mark suggested handling beyond routine and coincided with Simmons's earlier hesitations. Pirbright made a note. It was precisely the kind of trivial detail that others dismissed, yet often it was the pivot upon which the explanation of events rested. By late morning the station hummed with ordinary activity. Trains arrived and departed with minor delays, commuters scurried for connections, and Mr. Jebb fussed over pastries with persistent diligence. Yet Pirbright's gaze continuously returned to the small anomalies, the creased timetable, the smudged parcel label, the clock's subtle gain, and the faint but telling gestures of those around him. He understood that the truth of the morning's disorder lay not in dramatic incidents, but in these understated irregularities, the kind that could easily be overlooked, yet spoke volumes to a careful observer. He made a brief note in his diary. Re-examine timetable crease, observe parcel label. Monitor minor gestures of staff and commuters. Clock gain persistent. The words were simple, yet each represented a thread that, when followed, promised to reveal more than appearances suggested. By midday, Pirbright had established a quiet framework of observation. The first suspect, Simmons, remained socially implicated, yet his behavior did not entirely conform to the neat narrative the town had constructed. Minor irregularities, the timetable, the parcel, the gestures, the clock, demanded patience, analysis, and the cultivation of insight beyond superficial appearances. Flaxborough's ordinary facade, the inspector reflected, concealed subtle patterns that required time to unfold, and the day's trivial yet odd detail was the first tangible hint of a deeper truth awaiting discovery. By mid-morning, Pirbright had begun to widen his enquiries beyond the familiar precincts of the station, guided by the faint but persistent irregularities he had observed. The first expansion of the field involved Mr. Collingwood, the town's clockmaker, a man of precise habits and delicate temperament, whose shop smelled faintly of oil and aged wood. Collingwood greeted Pirbright with measured civility, as if his workbench demanded both respect and discretion. When questioned about the station clock, he inspected it with meticulous care, noting its slight advance in minutes, but offering no judgment. His observations, though professional, hinted at a broader awareness of timekeeping irregularities that seemed to extend beyond machinery into the town's rhythms themselves. Next, Pirbright visited Miss Ainsworth, a solicitor, from a neighbouring town who had arrived in Flaxborough recently. She was concerned with a minor transaction regarding property near the station, and, during their discussion, mentioned having noticed a parcel delivered with unusual discretion and a gentleman lingering longer than customary. Her comment, almost incidental in tone, carried implications. An external presence, unfamiliar, yet unremarkable in appearance, had intersected with the station's otherwise predictable activity. Pirbright filed this without response, noting how ordinary events often concealed the quietly extraordinary when observed with attention. In parallel, he spoke briefly with Mr. Fawkes, the local journalist, who, despite a propensity for embellishment, had observed behaviours and small deviations at the station with surprising accuracy. Fawkes described the subtle gestures of staff, the odd handling of parcels, and the general ripple of concern among commuters. While much of his narrative was coloured by social interpretation, it nonetheless corroborated certain minor anomalies Pirbright had previously noted: the pigeon, the crumpled ticket, and the clock's minute gain. Returning to the station, Pirbright observed staff and commuters in situ. The first obvious suspect, Simmons, continued his duties. With careful diligence, yet minor discrepancies remained. Slight pauses when handling specific parcels, the occasional glance toward the left luggage office, and an almost imperceptible hesitation in recounting events when questioned. Each behavior, trivial in isolation, formed part of a pattern that suggested attentiveness rather than negligence, or perhaps concealment rather than error. Mrs. Tremaine arrived, resuming her observation of the concourse with a discreetly elevated sense of social scrutiny. She spoke briefly with Miss Fenton, and the two exchanged glances that indicated mutual awareness of irregularities, though each framed their observations differently, one emphasizing propriety, the other embellishment. Their dialogue, subtly layered, provided Pirbright with insight into how social hierarchies and personal biases shaped perception, amplifying minor irregularities into matters of significance. Meanwhile, Mr. Jebb fussed over the buffet and observed the station master's movements with the meticulousness of a man invested in minor authority. Pirbright noted each action, the precise adjustments of pastry trays, the faint tightening of the jaw when observing staff, the slight reddening at the temples. Behavior, he reflected, often spoke more clearly than words. As the morning unfolded, an additional thread emerged. A regular commuter mentioned noticing a small, neatly folded envelope left in the station waiting room the previous day, unclaimed and unremarked upon until now. The envelope, trivial in appearance, hinted at private communication or minor secrecy. Pirbright recorded its existence and position without commentary, understanding that minor items often held significance disproportionate to their size or apparent importance. Later, a brief encounter with the station master confirmed that an unfamiliar gentleman previously noted by Miss Ainsworth had returned briefly to inquire about a parcel of interest, requesting that it be handled discreetly. The interaction was polite, almost perfunctory, yet it introduced the possibility of external involvement in what had previously seemed purely local affairs. Pirbright made a quiet note, aware that minor deviations from routine often intersected with human behavior in revealing ways. Throughout the day, Pirbright maintained a delicate balance, observing without disrupting, questioning without implying accusation, noting without immediate inference. Each individual, staff, commuter, visitor, offered minute gestures, pauses, and inflections that contributed to an increasingly complex picture of the station and its surrounding social field. No detail was dismissed. Every glance, hesitation, and adjustment had potential significance, a subtle clue to underlying motives. By late afternoon, Pirbright's expanded field included not only the station staff, but also peripheral figures: the clockmaker, the solicitor, the journalist, and the occasional commuter whose casual observations had, over time, revealed patterns of human reaction. Minor rivalries, hidden agendas, and the interplay of social expectation were all recorded in his careful notes. Even trivial events, the handling of parcels, the creased timetable, the pigeon's audacious intervention, were now contextualized within a broader tapestry of behavior. He concluded the day with tea in the quiet precinct office, reviewing his accumulated observations. The first obvious suspect remained socially implicated, yet evidence suggested that the situation was more intricate than public perception acknowledged. The anomalies, the clock's gain, the timetable crease, the parcel handling, the subtle reactions of staff and visitors hinted at human intentions layered beneath routine behavior, requiring patient interpretation. Pirbright's calm reflection emphasized a single principle. Truth in Flaxborough was rarely immediate, rarely simple, but always discoverable through careful attention to the interplay of people, objects, and circumstance. By evening, the inspector had constructed an increasingly detailed mental map of the station's microcosm, the visible patterns of behavior, the subtle irregularities, and the quietly emergent connections among townfolk, visitors, and staff. The expanded field offered no dramatic revelation, yet the complexity of social interplay promised that eventual clarity would emerge not from a single act, but from the aggregation of minor telling details. Flaxborough, in its ordinary rhythm, concealed precisely the patterns that Pirbright had learned to discern, patiently and unobtrusively, beneath the surface of polite civility. The next morning unfolded with an air of ordinary routine, yet a subtle tension had begun to pervade the station. Pirbright observed the familiar rhythm of arrivals and departures, the station clock continuing its slight advance, commuters navigating the concourse with habitual efficiency, and staff executing their duties with minor fluctuations of focus. The day seemed unremarkable until the public announcement system emitted a sudden, unexpected cacophony. A garbled message blared across the platform, startling both passengers and staff, and prompting a mild scramble to silence it. Mr. Jebb, already inclined to view every minor disturbance as a personal affront, fussed and gestured with indignation, demanding explanations that were polite yet pointed. Simmons approached cautiously, apologizing with measured politeness, though the gesture carried no hint of malice. The announcement system, it emerged, had briefly failed due to a minor electrical fault, yet the timing and suddenness of the disruption imbued it with a social significance beyond technical error. Passengers murmured and speculated, embellishing the incident in real time. One commuter suggested sabotage, another hinted at interference by a rival station or an external party, and Mrs. Tremaine observed the confusion with heightened vigilance, noting minor procedural lapses with the precision of a concerned citizen. Pirbright, moving unobtrusively among them, catalogued reactions, micro-expressions of irritation, subtle gestures of concern, and the almost imperceptible relief when the system was restored. The inspector's attention, as ever, was drawn to the minor anomalies surrounding the incident. The announcement disruption coincided with a moment when the station master had been briefly engaged with an external visitor, the very gentleman previously noted by Ms. Ainsworth, whose presence had passed largely unremarked the day before. The parcel in question had been momentarily unattended, and the creased timetable lay in its usual position, seemingly insignificant yet quietly contributing to a pattern of small disturbances. As the morning progressed, further irregularities surfaced. A commuter passing the left luggage office noticed a minor misplacement of parcels, items slightly out of sequence, which, under ordinary circumstances, would have been inconsequential. Yet coupled with the announcement disruption, the clock's minute gain, and the previous day's events, the cumulative effect suggested a convergence of minor anomalies that warranted careful attention. Pirbright noted these intersections without overt commentary, understanding that the aggregation of trivialities often revealed more than dramatic incidents alone. In conversations with staff, subtle discrepancies emerged. Simmons described the electrical fault accurately but hesitated when asked about the sequence of parcel handling during the disruption. Mr. Jebb recounted the sequence of adjustments and his observations of the commuter responses, emphasizing procedural propriety while revealing through minor exaggeration his own social anxieties. Miss Fenton, observing from the concourse railing, commented on decorum and the potential perception of negligence, highlighting both her moral vigilance and her attentiveness to subtle breaches of protocol. By mid-morning, Pirbright had gathered sufficient insight to see that the first obvious suspect, Simmons, could not fully account for the incident in a way consistent with either negligence or malice. While social perception still implicated him, the second incident had expanded the field of possibility, introducing factors beyond his immediate control and subtly undermining the neat narrative previously established by gossip and conjecture. A brief review of the station log confirmed that the announcement fault had coincided precisely with the brief presence of the external gentleman, and the minor misplacement of parcels had occurred during a period when attention was divided across multiple small responsibilities. Pirbright noted the precise timing, gestures, and sequence, understanding that behavior, not mechanical failure alone, was central to unraveling the underlying patterns. In the concourse, the town's response mirrored the quiet social spectacle of the previous day. Passengers speculated with enthusiasm, embellishing technical failure into potential intrigue, while staff maintained an air of procedural propriety. Mrs. Tremaine, observing from her usual bench, added commentary to each small detail, her indignation tempered by the polite amusement of onlookers. Miss Fenton, meanwhile, continued to frame events in terms of propriety and moral oversight, offering subtle guidance to those willing to heed it. Pirbright, as he had before, moved among the human microcosm with careful observation. Each gesture, hesitation, and micro-expression was recorded silently. The slight reddening of Mr. Jebb's face, the subtle adjustment of Simmons's collar, the measured but pointed attention of Miss Fenton, and the quiet amusement of passengers who perceived themselves as witnesses to minor drama. In these details, the inspector discerned the social undercurrents that elevated technical mishaps into incidents of consequence. By late afternoon, it was clear to Pirbright that the second incident had altered the investigative landscape. The neat attribution of fault to Simmons had been subtly challenged. The timing, the presence of an unfamiliar gentleman, and the cumulative minor irregularities suggested a broader set of influences. Pirbright reflected that in Flaxborough, truth rarely conformed to the expectations of gossip or superficial observation. He recorded his observations in the precinct diary with meticulous care. Announcement, disruption noted. Timing coincides with external visitor. Parcel misplacement and minor irregularities persist. First suspect insufficient explanation. The words were simple, yet they captured the evolving complexity of what the town perceived as a straightforward matter. Pirbright understood that patience, discretion, and careful observation were the means by which the deeper truth would ultimately be revealed. As evening settled over the station, the clock continued its quiet gain, the parcels were restored to order, and the town's social machinery resumed its rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, minor anomalies, the announcement disruption, the external visitor, the handling of parcels, and the subtle responses of staff and commuters had begun to coalesce into a discernible pattern. Pirbright sipped his tea in the precinct office, reflecting on the convergence of small events and human behaviour, aware that the narrative of Flaxborough's ordinary facade had shifted ever so slightly, promising revelations that would require careful patience to discern. Pirbright spent the following morning in the quiet of his precinct office, surrounded by orderly stacks of files, the faint smell of ink and paper mingling with the aroma of freshly poured tea. The events at the station, the minor disruptions, and the subtle reactions of townsfolk had been carefully recorded, each observation catalogued not only for its factual content, but for the behavioral nuance it revealed. Sitting with a slight stoop, pen poised over his diary, he allowed himself a rare moment of contemplation, examining the intersections of human behavior and social expectation that had quietly governed the unfolding incidents. He reflected on the nature of Flaxborough itself, a town whose civility masked subtle tensions, minor rivalries, and the gentle assertion of social hierarchy. Mrs. Tremaine's indignation, though socially performative, revealed a preoccupation with personal dignity. Miss Fenton's moral oversight masked both curiosity and anxiety, and Mr. Jebb's meticulous fussing over the buffet betrayed a need to assert authority, however trivial the circumstance. Even Simmons, outwardly careless, displayed behavioral cues that suggested attentiveness, interrupted only by divided responsibility or discreet caution. Each human element, when viewed collectively, formed a lattice of small motives and understated intentions. Pirbright's mind wandered to the clock, perpetually gaining its minute, and to the creased timetable, the smudged parcel label, and the mysterious gentleman whose presence had coincided with the announcement disruption. None of these anomalies were dramatic on their own, yet together they suggested a delicate convergence of ordinary irregularities. He considered how easily townsfolk, guided by habit, hearsay, and selective attention, could assign blame prematurely, weaving tidy narratives that concealed complexity beneath apparent simplicity. The inspector sipped his tea, noting the faint ripples on the surface, and allowed himself a quiet wryness at the human penchant for embellishment. The station had become a theatre of microdrama, minor events inflated into matters of moral significance, gestures and pauses interpreted as evidence of guilt, and small discrepancies magnified into social scandal. Yet Pirbright recognized that truth was rarely captured in dramatic flourishes. It was present in the cumulative weight of minor behaviors, subtle deviations from routine, and the interplay of observation and reaction. He revisited his notes, tracing the sequence of incidents, the pigeon's disruption, the misplaced parcels, the custard tart calamity, the clock's slow advance, and the crumpled timetable. Each irregularity, seemingly inconsequential, intersected with human perception in ways that illuminated patterns otherwise hidden. The first obvious suspect remained socially implicated, yet the convergence of minor anomalies suggested that the narrative was incomplete and that the full explanation required patience, discretion, and careful observation. Pirbright allowed his thoughts to dwell on the psychology of small communities. Flaxborough, like any closely knit town, operated under the twin pressures of reputation and expectation. Behavior, more than formal evidence, guided social judgment. Subtle gestures, hesitation, and micro-expression often held more significance than overt testimony. In this context, the incidents at the station were a lens through which the inspector could study human nature, revealing contradictions between appearance and intention, pride and modesty, anxiety and diligence. He considered the external gentleman once more, the timing of his appearances and the subtle influence he exerted without apparent engagement. The presence of outsiders, Pirbright reflected, often amplified the sensitivity of the local social fabric, provoking both curiosity and conjecture. Even minor anomalies, parcel handling, small gestures, and the clock's variance, took on greater weight in the context of a tension divided between local routine and unfamiliar interference. By midday, Pirbright had formed a mental map of behavioral threads, noting which patterns required further observation and which could be dismissed as socially amplified noise. The interplay between human error, social expectation, and minor external influence was delicate yet consistent. It demanded patience. The narrative would not be clarified through rush or presumption, but through careful alignment of small, telling details. He allowed himself a brief glance out of the office window at the station beyond. Commuters moved with habitual purpose, staff attended to routine tasks, and the clock continued its quiet, imperceptible advance. Each figure, each gesture, contributed to the broader tableau, and Pirbright considered how easily ordinary life concealed irregularities, waiting for the discerning eye to discern the connections that others overlooked. Finally, he returned to his diary and recorded a series of subtle observations, patterns of human behavior consistent but nuanced, external influence noted, minor anomalies convergent, first suspect socially implicated but insufficient evidence, patience required. The words were succinct, yet they encapsulated both the facts and the philosophy guiding his methodical attention. Pirbright closed the diary with deliberate calm, allowing a small inward satisfaction at the clarity emerging through observation. Flaxborough's ordinary rhythm had not changed, yet, beneath the surface, a network of subtle irregularities and minor tensions had revealed itself to the patient observer. The task ahead would be to test the alignment of these observations, to allow the town's own habits, errors, and reactions to expose the truth quietly, without confrontation, in the understated, precise manner that only patient attention could reveal. The following morning, Pirbright arrived at the station with the calm deliberation that had become his hallmark, fully aware that the subtle threads he had observed required careful orchestration before revealing themselves. His plan was neither elaborate nor confrontational. It consisted simply of a carefully staged scenario designed to allow human behavior to speak for itself. A polite invitation had been extended to Mrs. Tremaine, Miss Fenton, Mr. Jebb, and, discreetly, Simmons to attend morning tea in the station buffet under the pretext of reviewing minor procedural improvements. The inspector understood that the setting, ordinary, familiar, yet slightly formal, would elicit responses more revealing than direct interrogation. As guests arrived, each displayed behavior consistent with prior observation. Mrs. Tremaine approached with cautious dignity, maintaining a delicate balance between curiosity and propriety. Miss Fenton's posture was rigid, hands folded neatly, eyes scanning for perceived irregularities. Mr. Jebb fussed over the arrangement of teacups and saucers, ensuring the table reflected his habitual sense of order. Simmons, aware of being observed, moved with slightly heightened attention, his usual casualness moderated by the social framing of the meeting. Pirbright began with neutral conversation, allowing topics to drift naturally between station matters, minor procedural adjustments, and local gossip. The tea was poured with precision and small courtesies were exchanged, each interaction presenting the possibility of revealing subtle behavioral cues. Pirbright observed attentively the slight hesitation in Mrs. Tremaine's responses, the measured tone of Miss Fenton's remarks, the micro-expressions of Jebb's mild irritation, and the barely perceptible tension in Simmons's gestures. Without explicit accusation, he introduced a reference to the parcel in question, casually noting that its arrival the previous day had caused a minor stir. The remark was phrased with light humour, sufficiently polite to avoid defensiveness, yet pointed enough to elicit subtle reactions. Mrs. Tremaine, eager to contribute to the narrative, elaborated on the incident, emphasizing the social disruption it had caused, while Miss Fenton framed it as a breach of station protocol. Jeb, frowning slightly, adjusted a napkin as though to assert authority over decorum, and Simmons's hand twitched imperceptibly near the register, betraying an awareness of scrutiny. Pirbright then allowed a brief silence, observing how each participant filled the space. The subtle test lay not in direct questioning, but in their natural responses. Mrs. Tremaine offered conjectures about misplaced items. Miss Fenton emphasized procedural propriety. Jeb highlighted inefficiencies among staff, and Simmons, despite maintaining composure, displayed slight micro-expressions, an almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes, and a careful avoidance of certain topics. These were minor gestures, yet precisely the kind that revealed the underlying distribution of knowledge and responsibility. He continued by referencing the clock, phrased as casual observation. "The station clock seems in slightly more of a hurry than we are. Odd, isn't it?" The statement elicited varying reactions. Mrs. Tremaine tilted her head, attempting to reconcile it with the previous day's events. Miss Fenton's brows furrowed, interpreting the remark as potential evidence of disorder. Jeb straightened, adjusting his posture in tacit authority, and Simmons glanced toward the mechanism, subtly revealing recognition without comment. Pirbright noted each response with quiet precision. The test intensified subtly when he placed the creased timetable on the table, leaving it within casual reach. He made no comment, merely continuing conversation on unrelated topics. Observers interacted naturally, yet Simmons's behavior betrayed the slightest hesitation when the timetable was referenced. A brief pause in movement, a fleeting glance toward Pirbright, and a subtle tightening of the lips. The inspector noted this, understanding that small deviations under mild social pressure often revealed more than overt questioning. At intervals, Pirbright introduced neutral topics, weather, local markets, railway timetables, to maintain conversational flow while allowing micro-reactions to occur. Mrs. Tremaine, in her habitual attentiveness to social propriety, occasionally glanced at the parcels. Miss Fenton observed both staff and guests with measured calculation. Jeb adjusted the arrangement of the buffet service, and Simmons, despite minimal verbal contribution, exhibited the micro-gestures of someone quietly aware of scrutiny and the implications of prior actions. By late morning, the cumulative observations had produced the outcome Pirbright had anticipated. The sequence of small reactions, pauses, micro-expressions, gestures, and timing provided insight into both knowledge and motivation. The first obvious suspect, while still socially implicated, revealed through these subtle cues that the narrative of negligence was incomplete. Human behavior, he reflected, was rarely linear. It emerged in patterns and deviations, often unnoticed by those engaged in their own socially constructed narratives. Pirbright concluded the session with polite, neutral farewells, observing as each participant departed. Mrs. Tremaine maintained dignity tempered by curiosity. Miss Fenton's posture remained upright and alert. Jeb fussed one last time over the arrangement of cutlery, and Simmons moved with a quiet precision, suggestive of measured attentiveness rather than error. The test, unobtrusive yet deliberate, had illuminated not only the distribution of knowledge but the alignment of intention and social expectation. Returning to his office, Pirbright reviewed his notes and considered the significance of each micro-reaction. The minor anomalies, the clock, the creased timetable, the parcels, and the subtle behavioral cues elicited during the test were now positioned in a coherent framework. The first obvious suspect remained socially implicated, yet the broader pattern of observations suggested that human error alone did not account for the sequence of incidents. Patience and observation had yielded clarity, while the town remained largely unaware of the subtle dynamics that had been revealed in the measured theatre of polite inquiry. The station waiting room, quiet in the late afternoon, provided the perfect setting for Pirbright's exposition. The bustle of commuters had subsided, leaving only the faint creak of benches and the occasional distant whistle of a departing train. Mrs. Tremaine, Miss Fenton, Mr. Jebb, and Simmons had been invited under the guise of reviewing minor operational matters, yet Pirbright knew that the calm environment would allow him to unfold the truth with precision, without spectacle or dramatics. He began by addressing the first obvious suspect, Simmons, whose posture was alert but composed. "We have examined the events of the past 2 days," Pirbright said evenly, "and considered the minor irregularities, the parcel, the timetable, the clock, and the announcement disruption. Each in isolation appears trivial, yet their sequence, coupled with human responses, reveals a subtler pattern." He paused, allowing his words to settle, measured like the gentle swing of a pendulum. Turning first to the clock, Pirbright explained the slight advance in minutes, noting that its mechanism had been affected by a recent minor repair, the irregularity unnoticed by casual observation. The clock, he observed, had been a benign anomaly, yet it had subtly influenced perceptions of timing and responsibility among both staff and passengers. Mrs. Tremaine's eyebrows rose slightly, an acknowledgement of the innocuous mechanical explanation, while Miss Fenton inclined her head, appreciating the precise framing. He then addressed the parcel, its misplacement, and the crumpled ticket. Pirbright noted that Simmons, though occasionally inattentive in routine tasks, had acted correctly in all critical respects. The minor discrepancies had been amplified by social observation and conjecture. The ticket, folded and misplaced in Mrs. Tremaine's handbag, had contributed to the impression of irregularity, but was simply evidence of human habit and oversight rather than deliberate error. "The custard tart incident," he continued, "was an unfortunate consequence of delivery procedures rather than personal negligence. Mr. Jebb's fussing, while socially significant, had drawn attention to a minor procedural lapse that would have passed unnoticed in less observant circumstances." Pirbright's tone remained calm, precise, and courteous, allowing each participant to appreciate the distinction between perception and reality. Regarding the announcement disruption, Pirbright explained the coincidence of timing with the brief presence of the external gentleman who had inquired about a specific parcel. His actions were entirely legitimate, yet in combination with the station's minor irregularities, they had created the appearance of external interference. This, in turn, had magnified the significance of Simmons's routine handling and the staff's minor hesitations, producing a sequence that seemed suggestive of fault where none existed. Pirbright observed the reactions of his audience closely. Simmons' expression relaxed slightly, a micro-expression of relief passing over his features. Mrs. Tremaine maintained a composed curiosity, adjusting her gloves with precision, while Miss Fenton nodded minutely, her moral framing of events now reconciled with the explanation of ordinary circumstances. Mr. Jebb, still attentive to social propriety, allowed the realization of benign causality to settle without further fuss. The inspector then addressed the subtle gestures, pauses, and minor anomalies that had guided his observations. Each small deviation, he explained, had been a behavioral clue rather than proof of misconduct. By observing micro-expressions, hesitations, and subtle interactions, he had determined that the sequence of events arose not from malice, but from the intersection of ordinary human habits, mechanical quirks, and social interpretation. he concluded by emphasizing the town's own role in shaping perception. Flaxborough, he noted with gentle irony, had a talent for transforming minor irregularities into narratives of significance, embellishing, speculating, and assigning responsibility in ways that were both predictable and instructive. The investigation had been as much about observing human behavior as it had been about examining parcels or timetables. Simmons, now visibly relieved, inclined his head politely. Mrs. Tremaine allowed a faint smile, acknowledging both her own embellishments and the benign explanation. Miss Fenton's expression conveyed measured approval, while Mr. Jebb adjusted the table arrangement one last time, conceding that social order had been restored. Pirbright, seated with composed calm, reflected that the sequence of minor anomalies, the clock, the timetable, the parcels, the announcement, the gestures, had revealed precisely the complex interplay of human and mechanical factors that he had anticipated. The revelation, delivered in the understated civil tone characteristic of Pirbright's method, left the participants informed yet unshaken in dignity. No accusation had been required, no dramatics had been necessary. The truth, quietly elucidated, restored order and clarified the roles of all involved. Social perception, human error, and mechanical imperfection had converged to create the illusion of fault, and it was only through patient observation and subtle inquiry that the ordinary truth had been restored. By the time Pirbright concluded, the station waiting room had returned to calm. The minor disturbances had been reconciled, and the social tension dissolved into a polite satisfaction. The inspector allowed himself a small inward acknowledgment that Flaxborough, despite its minor anomalies and human foibles, had once again demonstrated that civility, careful attention, and subtle insight were sufficient to navigate even the most deceptively intricate of circumstances. The morning following Pirbright's revelation unfolded with an air of ordinary civility. The station's iron framework gleaming faintly in soft light, the clock ticking slightly ahead, but now unremarkable to those who passed beneath it. Commuters arrived and departed with habitual efficiency. Staff attended to parcels and passengers with quiet diligence, and the minor tensions of previous days had begun to settle into the familiar rhythm of routine. Yet beneath the surface, subtle changes had taken root, imperceptible to casual observation, but apparent to one attuned to human behavior. Simmons moved among his duties with a quiet composure, no longer shadowed by the town's premature assignment of blame. His gestures, though unchanged in outward form, now carried the ease of one whose attentiveness was understood rather than questioned. The parcel arrangements were restored, the timetable properly aligned, and the announcement system functioned without irregularity. Even the station clock, gaining its habitual minute, seemed to bear less significance now, its advance a trivial note in the otherwise orderly cadence of daily life. Mrs. Tremaine resumed her vigil from the waiting-room bench, her posture slightly more relaxed, yet still dignified, reflecting both the benign resolution of the incidents and the social proprieties she held dear. She observed arrivals with a polite attention, occasionally adjusting her gloves or repositioning her notebook, small rituals that now carried no shadow of indignation. Miss Fenton, in her measured way, monitored the concourse with the same careful attention to decorum, her moral vigilance undiminished, but tempered by the knowledge that perceived disorder had been clarified without embarrassment. Mr. Jebb, ever meticulous, continued to fuss over the buffet and the arrangement of pastries and cutlery, though his gestures were now lightened by the understanding that procedural order had been subtly but firmly restored. The social assertion that had driven his previous anxieties had resolved into quiet satisfaction, a recognition that minor disturbances had been addressed with civility rather than confrontation. Pirbright observed him with mild amusement, noting how human concern for appearance and propriety often dictated the perception of events more than the events themselves. In the concourse, Passengers moved with habitual rhythm, some exchanging polite remarks about the normality of the morning, others glancing briefly at the clock or the left luggage office, as if confirming that the town's order had been re-established. The cumulative effect of small human gestures, the alignment of parcels, the attentive conduct of staff, the courteous exchange of farewells, reinforced the sense that Flaxborough's ordinary pace had resumed, though quietly altered by the awareness of past irregularities. Pirbright returned to his office in the precinct, sitting with deliberate calm to review notes, cross-referencing behavioral observations with procedural events. The incidents, the crumpled timetable, the misplaced parcel, the clock's subtle gain, the announcement disruption, and the subtle human reactions had revealed both the fragility and resilience of social order. He reflected on the town's readiness to assign blame, the amplification of minor anomalies through gossip, and the patience required to discern truth beneath polite appearances. The inspector considered the broader patterns revealed by the unfolding events. Flaxborough, he noted, functioned through a delicate interplay of observation, social expectation, and human error. Minor tensions, when unexamined, had a tendency to distort perception, yet careful attention, patient inquiry, and subtle testing had restored clarity. Human behavior, he reflected, offered insights as reliable as mechanical evidence, provided it was observed with patience, discretion, and precision. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the station had returned to a near-perfect equilibrium. Staff conducted their duties with quiet competence, passengers engaged in routine travel, and the town's social machinery resumed its ordinary hum. Yet subtle changes lingered. Mrs. Tremaine's attention to minor detail was sharpened by experience. Miss Fenton's moral oversight carried tempered authority, and Jeb's fussing now reflected confidence rather than anxious control. Even Simmons, whose presence had been socially precarious, operated with a discreet awareness of his responsibilities and the tacit understanding of those around him. Pirbright allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, observing from his office window the interplay of movement, gesture, and social interaction. The small anomalies, once disruptive, had been reconciled, and the town's civility preserved. Yet beneath the surface he recognized the subtle alterations. Human behavior had adjusted, routines had been recalibrated, and the rhythm of daily life now bore the quiet imprint of insight and resolution. As the afternoon sun illuminated the polished ironwork of the station and glinted softly across the clock face, Pirbright returned to his paperwork with deliberate composure. The incidents were resolved, the minor mysteries clarified, and the social order, both fragile and enduring, had reasserted itself. In Flaxborough, life proceeded with its familiar cadence, small anomalies acknowledged but no longer disruptive, and the town's inhabitants unaware of the delicate orchestration that had restored ordinary equilibrium with patience, observation, and understated civility.